Welcome
to the Expert
PK
and Newbie podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Expert PK and Newbie podcast, the podcast where each week we take a passage of the Bible, we read it together, and we get the three different perspectives of the three different people. As always, I have with me Lachlan Miller, our expert.
Hello.
Morgan Carter, our newbie.
Hi.
And I'm Joshua Lee, the PK pastor's kid. How are we all doing?
Well, I'm coming off an exciting weekend where we baptized one of our youth, and then next weekend we're going to baptize 3 more of our youth.
Wow.
And so it's just quite an exciting season where we get to see these young people stand before their church family and say, hey, I love Jesus. I want to serve him for the rest of my life. And so as a youth pastor, it's literally the best feeling ever.
Nice.
So going very well.
Do you get to baptize them, or will that be someone else?
At our church, as long as you've been baptized, you can baptize people. And so most of the time our youth choose their direct kind of pod leaders to baptize them, which is a really special moment for them because they've had these leaders for many, many years and they've been journeying alongside them closely.
Oh, that's good.
And then they get to have that leader baptize them, which is exciting.
Oh, that's special.
Morgan, how are you?
I'm good. Just in the peak of the uni term, so busy trying to balance work and uni, but getting there. I'm just freezing in Melbourne again. But other than that, good. Good. How about you, Josh?
Good. I'm good. I've just come off a camp over the weekend, and that was really nice with the youth organisation I'm with, and all the kids seemed to really enjoy themselves, which was really nice. And I mean, that's the main reason why you're there, is that making sure they have a good time, and when they have the smiles on their face, that means that you've done a good job, and you keep coming back to do this. So I'm doing really well. So I'm going to plug it at the beginning. We have a Patreon, but we also have social media. So if you're interested in our Patreon, or you're not up to date with any of our social media, head over to our link tree and you can get all the information there. So we've got our social medias, but if you also want to support us on Patreon, you can head over to Patreon. Lockie, what chapters are we doing today?
We're going to be reading chapters 43 through to 47 of Genesis.
Today's passage comes from the book of Genesis, chapters 43 to 47. The ongoing famine forces Joseph's brothers to return to Egypt, where Joseph continues to deceive them and threatens to imprison Benjamin. Judah pleads passionately for Benjamin, offering to take his place and showing his dramatic character change. Moved by Judah's speech, Joseph reveals who he is and tells his brothers he no longer harbors any ill will towards them. Upon hearing that Joseph is alive, his father Jacob relocates his entire family to Egypt, where Pharaoh grants them land and provisions.
As we kick off, I just want to point out that is the most we've ever gotten our listeners to read in one go. So firstly, please read the section of scripture that we're talking about. It makes the episodes make so much more sense. Secondly, don't be discouraged if that took you a while, because that was a huge section. But today we're going to try and discuss all of it and understand what is happening in our second last episode about Genesis. But who remembers what happened last week?
I remember bits and pieces of it. My time hearing the story of Joseph. There were some dreams that went on and were interpreted. We saw some people in prison. And then we finished our last episode with Joseph's brothers coming to find him, but not recognizing him.
Yeah. So Joseph is sort of stuck, as you said, stuck in Egypt, and he becomes, as a slave, quite high up in one household, but then thrown in jail after an incident with that person's wife. And then, as you were saying, Morgan, the head baker and the head cupbearer are also thrown into jail, but they have these peculiar dreams, and Joseph's able to interpret them, but interpret them through God. That's a very important one to remember. And they get let go, and unfortunately forget about Joseph until they eventually the cupbearer remembers, and the dreams get interpreted. Pharaoh's dreams get interpreted, and then Pharaoh makes Joseph almost the second in charge of the land, and the famine hits, and as you said, Morgan, the brothers come and don't recognize him, and Joseph deceives them by putting the gold back, but also saying that you can't face me ever again unless you bring your youngest brother, with you. And that's where it sort of ends up.
Yeah. We ended with Joseph's brothers have returned to their father with enough food to last a little while, and they can't go back to Egypt for any more grain unless they bring Benjamin with them. We also have to remember that poor Simeon is in prison in Egypt as well.
Oh, yes. I forgot about that. And Jacob, the father of the 12 brothers, is very old and can't bear the thought of losing Benjamin.
Because Benjamin is now the new favorite.
Yes. So 43 starts with Judah talking.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see a lot of Judah talking and throughout what we've read, but starting to see sort of Judah's almost redemption arc or him transitioning into this better person, if you will.
He's definitely far more trusted than he once was. Like at the end of chapter 42, Reuben, who's the eldest, goes to Jacob and says, let me take Benjamin to Egypt. We're going to need more grain. Let's do it. And Jacob is hard, no, there's absolutely no way Benjamin's going with you. But here we see Judah going to Jacob and giving almost the exact same spiel, but this time Jacob is prepared to let Benjamin go with Judah up to Egypt.
Yeah, and I like what, poor Jacob, he's saying, like, why would you be so cruel to me? It says Jacob moaned, like, why on earth did you tell them that you had a younger brother that wasn't there? Like, why did you tell them any other information about our family? They didn't need to know that, but like, you've almost, like, by giving that information, you've like doomed us here.
But as Judah points out, they simply answered the questions of the guy in charge. They just still don't know that the guy in charge knows an awful lot about their family.
Yes.
And was probably asking very specific questions to figure out how his family was.
Which, you almost, it's like almost in like it's like a sad way, like Joseph's like getting this information. Like he doesn't want to reveal who he is, but he's like trying to hear, and you can imagine the emotions of like hearing about your family. And what's happened, but through this sort of weird and odd way of going about it, rather than just sort of coming out and saying and trying to get information. And like, there's a lot, like seeing the brothers for the first time, a lot of emotions going through and probably resentment of some sort.
Mm-hmm. And we see that very much in our chapter of 43, because when the brothers do go up into Egypt, the very first question Joseph asks is your father still alive?
Yeah.
And so he very much cares about what is going on there. But before we get to that bit,
yes, before we get there, Jacob sort of, as you said, goes, okay, well, this has to happen after Judah has sort of explained the situation, going, well, we're gonna run out of food at some point. We're gonna have to go back. This is gonna have, like, this is for our own survival. We're gonna have to do this. And they're sort of stuck in this sticky situation where they're gonna have to go back to Joseph, even knowing that if, with the risk of taking Benjamin, what might happen. But Judah does convince them, and Jacob gives a plan of, what to sort of do to try and maybe ease this person in charge so that nothing ill comes of them. And Benjamin, there's so many names, Benjamin comes back safely.
And what I find really insightful is Jacob goes, okay, may you all go off and let's hope that your other brother and Benjamin comes back. Now, what he means by the other brother is Simeon, who's still in an Egyptian jail cell somewhere. But what actually is going to end up happening is that the other brother, being Joseph, will also return.
Yeah.
So it's like this little hint within the text, because you would assume that Jacob would have said, let's hope that Simeon and Benjamin can come back. But it's left intentionally vague, almost as some type of foreshadowing.
The other brother.
And so all the brothers travel up to Egypt again, this time with double the amount of silver to replace the silver that had been returned to them, and then also with a selection of the local cuisines, including honey and almonds and a bunch of other good things.
So they head off with Benjamin, and they're all packed. They've brought all their money. They've got all their exotic cuisines. And when they get to Egypt, Joseph sees that Benjamin's there and goes and instructs the manager to take them into the household and prepare a feast for them so that they can all eat, which is really nice. But the brothers don't know that any of this is happening, and so that when they see that they're getting led to the house, they're terrified. They think, oh no, something's about to happen, something terrible is happening. And I would too. I would think, like, this trip needs to go perfect. Nothing needs to go awry or like anything like that for the sake of everyone here. Yeah. And I kind of find it funny that they are terrified, because we sort of have this knowledge about what's happening, but they don't. So it's like, I have this feeling of like, well, the brothers treated Joseph so poorly, so like, they're being terrified as like they're just, reaping their own reward here. They're like, like Joseph's getting back at them.
Yeah, and they express all of these concerns to the steward of the house. And he really tries his best to help them relax. He's like, no, God, like the God of your father is the reason that the silver was returned to your sacks last time you were here. It's okay. You're going to come in, you're going to have a meal with this ruler. And here is Simeon. I've even brought him out of prison to rejoin you all. Now go in and eat.
Yeah. And it's interesting how it's the God of your father. Like an Egyptian person saying that. They could have easily just used their own gods. Or just given credit to Pharaoh or like someone else, but they specifically call out Yahweh.
Yeah, and so clearly this steward has spent enough time around Joseph, and Joseph has clearly talked enough about or demonstrated his own faith in the God of Jacob.
I want to know what the fodder is.
Fodder's just animal food.
Oh,
It's literally just food that isn't fit for human consumption, but is for animals.
Why does Joseph weep at the sight of Benjamin? Is it because he hasn't met him before, or is there a reason specifically?
So Benjamin is Joseph's full brother. They have the same mother and the same father. And Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother. And so while the rest of his brothers are his half-brothers, and he probably has very negative thoughts towards them because they all sold him into slavery, Benjamin is his true brother who's never done a bad thing, to our knowledge, against him. And his younger brother, his little brother. So it's finally seeing a full flesh and blood relative for the first time.
I like how he refers to him as his mother's son.
And so I think out of pure joy and overcome with the thought of like, here is my family, he actually starts to weep uncontrollably and quickly exits the room.
I mean, if if the brothers at this point in the story see that, then the whole gig's up. At the very least, something's up.
Yeah.
And something's not right here. And so to save face, he's got to go. But it's a nice, like, little touching moment that, like, Joseph sort of really does care about his family and still, like, very much misses them and just almost wishes that life that he never had or never got to experience with them, even if it's just only for Benjamin.
Yeah.
And then you also see at the end how he says Benjamin's portions were 5 times as much as any of theirs. Is that favoritism again?
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. I mean, what's interesting, there's lots of interesting things about that whole dinner scene, but the thing that would have struck the brothers most is that Joseph seats them in age order, which as this random ruler of Egypt, he should have had no knowledge about. And so this scares them. They're like, who is this man that has such a deep insight into our family to seat us in order, and then even seems to know the conflict we've always had as a family in regards to Benjamin being the favorite since Joseph disappeared, and then plays into that favoritism by giving him 5-time portions.
I just don't know how they're not putting 2 and 2 together.
Well, I had that same thought, but they probably also told themselves that Joseph is dead. Like they probably believed that because they sold him and then he was never to be seen again. And so to maybe reconcile what they did and come to terms with it was just saying, well, our brother Joseph is actually dead. And so, you're going into this foreign land, you're going into this ruler's house, and they've already taken one brother away. There's already this like mishap happening. Like in any sort of like when you're the like subject and going into a ruler, or so, like even just like you're like the worker and you're going into your boss's office, you don't want to like mess up in front of them. So the last thing they're probably thinking about is Joseph.
And I've also just double checked the story where Joseph is sold to the slavers. And at no point do the brothers know that Joseph is then going to end up in Egypt, because they sell him to these desert nomads effectively. So they probably think he's out in the middle of the desert as a slave or dead. And so to be in the heart of civilization in Egypt isn't probably their first assumption about where he would be.
Yeah, and as like the second in command of like all of Egypt too.
Yeah, fair.
But I had the same thought too. It's like,
sure, and I just feel like if Benjamin's a full brother, like wouldn't there be maybe some resemblance, or I don't know. Obviously, there's quite a bit of age difference, but
we also don't know exactly what the dress style was like. Like we know the Egyptian style was cleanly shaven, and so they probably the last they saw Joseph, they probably expected if they would ever see him again with a big scraggly beard, because that was their custom. Whereas now they have a very clean shaven 20-year-old older looking version in who knows what sort of dress and garb and even makeup, or like we just don't know what the style was.
We could assume just probably looking very Egyptian.
Yes.
When I was reading verse 32, I found it a little bit confusing. So it says they served him by himself and then by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. What is going on?
Fair. When I read that, I was also very, very confused. Effectively, the Egyptian custom was that you would only share a table with other Egyptians. And so in this room, you have Joseph, you've got his brothers, and you've got a bunch of Egyptians. And so there was actually 3 tables or 3 groups eating in the one room. And so what it's saying is they served the Egyptian table and served them their food. They served Joseph, who was sitting on his own table because he couldn't share a table with the Egyptians.
Because he wasn't Egyptian.
Yeah. And then they put his brothers on yet another table because Joseph had to keep this guise up of, oh, I'm not one of you.
Yeah.
And so served them at their table as well. We actually see other documentation of Egyptians doing this later on in history. So, for instance, when the Greek Empire started rocking up in Egypt and trying to do trade and starting diplomacy, they found it really weird that whenever they tried to share a meal with the Egyptians, there was separate tables. And so this was a very common Egyptian practice.
Which eyebrows should have been raised at like, hang on a second. Like, they're not eating together. We've been separated. But why is the head of this house now separated from the other Egyptians?
I mean, you could see it as a status thing. Like, if this is like the second most important person in the kingdom, for all they knew, Pharaoh always ate alone and no one else was allowed on his table.
That's true. You would, head tables and all that, like not being allowed to be there or on the same status.
Yeah, so I don't think we should ever... It's hard. We can't under or over assume the knowledge that the characters in these stories have.
Definitely.
And we sit here with a bird's eye view of all of it, trying to figure out how much they actually know about the situation.
Yeah. And again, I think all the brothers were just thinking of, I just can't mess up. I just can't mess up. I just can't mess up.
As we head into 44, we see that Joseph hatches his plan and puts a silver cup into one of the sacks of grain that he's giving to his brothers. My question is why? What is Joseph's plan here?
Is he like plotting to see if he can trust them, to see if they've changed?
Definitely. Very much so.
I feel like it's just a bit of a test. Like, if they notice it's in there, will they keep it or will they own up and say something to test if they've changed or if they're still not good people?
Close. I think it's less to do with the theft and more to do with Benjamin. So what I think the plan is that Joseph is doing here is, yes, he definitely wants to see if his brothers have changed. But what he does is he wants to create a situation where they can profit by giving up Benjamin in the same way that they profited by giving up Joseph. And so that is the situation he's trying to create. And by creating that situation, he wants to see, have these brothers changed? Will they happily give up my father's favorite child for their own sake? Or have they repented? Have they changed that they would no longer do something like that?
They could have easily just said, well, he could have easily just done the same thing, put more money back into the sacks, and then be like, "Oh, hang on, where'd you get that money from?" But by specifically putting something else into Benjamin's sack, it's like, well, that person's more greedy than all of you, so I'm going to either take him away or punish Benjamin more, which in the like you just said is the same situation that happened with Joseph being the youngest.
Because at several points in this next chapter, the steward and then Joseph will give the brothers a way out. They will say, hey, we will just punish Benjamin for stealing this cup. The rest of you may go. Like, that offer is presented to the brothers. And that is the entire point of this plan, is to see whether they would sacrifice Benjamin.
And how does the plan turn out?
Well, let's walk through 44 and see, shall we?
What's interesting is they leave. So they don't actually notice anything's changed up until the point they left. And it's only until they've left that Joseph goes to, in my one it says the palace manager, but I'm assuming in your one it's saying steward.
Yes.
Yep. That's why you keep on saying steward.
Yeah, correct. I'm just reading what my Bible says.
Yeah, no, chase after and stop them. So I wonder if Joseph's plan was to see if they notice it straight away or like continue watch, but he can't keep watching them to see what happens if they've left. So he obviously needs them to be stopped so that they can, so the plan can come into fruition. And I like how the steward or the manager says, why have you stolen this magical future predicting cup?
I'm glad you've brought up the cup. I want to talk about the cup of divination.
Cup of divination?
Which is what the NIV calls it.
Yeah, this NLT just says it's a future predicting cup. It's a very sort of like basic.
Classic NLT doing some interpretive work for us. You see, firstly, the steward says, "This is the cup my master drinks from." So if this is the cup that is often used for drinking, it'd be stupid to steal it because obviously Joseph is going to know that it's missing. It's not like stealing a picture off the wall that maybe he never looks at. Like, that this is the cup he always uses for drinking. And then if this is also the cup that he uses for magical divination, then it's extra stupid to steal it because, once again, he's obviously going to notice it missing and go after it. However, there are people who don't think that's what it means by divination.
Okay.
And so, for instance, a very well-respected Genesis scholar, a man whose last name is Vigote, argues that this should be translated as, about this theft, he certainly would have divined. Or in other words, he would have realized. And so he argues that the translation here should be, it's not the cup used for divination, it's the cup that he would have divined or realized was missing because he uses it so often for drinking.
Oh, okay.
Is a proposed different translation rather than Joseph claiming magical power.
Yeah, which would seem, if you're taking that like literal on face value, would seem very out of character for Joseph. Because he shouldn't be putting
in the Hebrew worldview,
yeah, putting the power to the cup, saying, "Well, the cup's telling me what your dream meant, or like what Pharaoh's dream meant, or anyone else's." As we've seen so far in the story, Joseph has always given credit to God, and so if we're literally saying, "Well, this is a future predicting cup," that Joseph is literally like, I don't know, morning coffee, looks into it, like reading tea leaves or something like that. Like, oh, I can predict your future through this. Like, that would be so out of character because, again, well, God's gone out the window then.
Yeah. Now, we've said that one scholar thinks that. I'm definitely not a scholar on the same level as him, but there are other scholars who would say that the claim here is that it is a magic cup. However, Joseph is lying.
Yes.
Joseph is trying to instill fear in the brothers. Now, he starts that fear process by putting them in their perfect age order, which shows that he has some almost magical insight. And then he claims that he predicts the future via this cup, instilling more fear into them of, this man has supernatural insight. And I think that is actually what's trying to be conveyed here, is Joseph is lying to them to make them even more terrified of him.
And that's what I sort of initially thought as well. It was like, well, by saying it's like this special cup, anyone could be like, oh, it's just a cup. Why is it like, yes, it's the ruler's cup and we shouldn't, but it's a special cup and he's going to be real angry if it's like that one cup is really special and it's got these like mystical powers. And so I definitely think that, it's instilling this like more fear than it already would have instilled. It's now like real true fear of
next level fear.
Almost, is this a shaman that knows my every move or something like that?
But it's correct that you bring up it would be out of character for Joseph, who's an Israelite, because we'll see later in Israelite history, this is a quote from Numbers 23:23, where it says, "There is no divination within Israel, because at the due time it will simply be told to Israel from God what he is doing." Like, divination is not a thing that the Jews have ever practiced because they believe in a powerful, active God who will just reveal it to them directly rather than with special magical insight.
Yeah.
And so the trap has been perfectly laid. The cup has been discovered as stolen by Benjamin. The steward gives them a way out and says, "You can all go free. I'll just take Benjamin into custody." And Joseph's brothers tear their clothes in grief and return to Egypt with the steward so that they can beg at Joseph's feet for Benjamin.
Because like at this point, before they've like discovered what's in their sack, they're probably like, okay, good, we've gotten away scot-free. We can bring Benjamin back. Our father's going to be fine. Like, this is good. We don't have to worry anymore.
Why did they start tearing their clothes?
So tearing your clothes in the Bible is always a sign of grief and mourning. And so the brothers were so distraught that Benjamin had just been arrested because they knew that without Benjamin, Jacob was as good as dead. Like, that's what Jacob said in the previous chapter. If Benjamin doesn't come back home, I might as well go down to the grave now. And so this was their worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And also shows the change of heart and changing character that Joseph was hoping to see from them.
Yes. Well, especially because they go back. They're not like, we'll just take Benjamin and we'll flee. This is now like that test is coming into fruition here, and answering those questions that Joseph sort of put to them in this test. And it's Judah who answers Joseph.
In fact, Judah answers with the longest speech in Genesis.
So that's verse 18 onwards.
Yeah. Just a fun fact is that Judah does the most talking here in a row of any character in Genesis. But what I find the most interesting about this speech that he starts is he says that God has uncovered your servant's guilt. Now, they are actually innocent of taking the cup. So Judah cannot be referring to stealing the cup. I think Judah has realized the incredible similarity between this situation and the situation where him as the ringleader sold Joseph into slavery. And he's realized that God must be punishing them all now for his past sins against Joseph. And he seems almost ready to accept that punishment because while they're innocent now, they've definitely been guilty before.
And I think it's through Judah's experience. Like we got that story of Judah before. And I think if we hadn't have gotten that story or that just never happened for Judah, then I don't think we would have seen this change in character for Judah here. Yeah. Now sort of like realizing the gravity of the situation and that this must be like the work of the Lord and like these are our sins being like brought forward here. You know, I think this is really seeing that like arc and we need that story of Judah as random as it kind of can be is like from first glance.
Yeah, chapter 38 felt so random.
Just out of just like why do we need this? Especially because we were so looking at Joseph, but we need that to see like how far Judah has come.
He is prepared to take all of the punishment upon his own head for the crimes of Benjamin so that Benjamin can go free. This is the same man that sold Joseph into slavery, is now prepared to lay down his life for the favored child.
And I wonder what Joseph would have felt, one, for like seeing Judah step up like this, but then, well, we actually do sort of see.
I was going to say, your question is perfectly answered by the first verse of chapter 45.
100%. But like, I also wonder what he would have felt when he heard Judah say, like, "My Lord, we have a father who is an old man and his younger son, child of an old age," and like going on about how if Benjamin, the youngest, doesn't come back, our father will die. Like, I wonder what like Joseph's thought of like. Part of me thought when reading it, going, Joseph would have been like, "Oh, hang on," like like he probably like not wanting anything to happen to his father. Probably would have been like, okay, so we now need to sort of think about this situation here and how we sort of play this out. Because I'm sure Joseph doesn't want anything ill to come from his father, but still wants to see this change or to see if they have changed, the other brothers.
But we see Joseph's emotional response to this.
Yes.
We see that he is so moved by Judah's speech about his pleading for Benjamin that he can no longer control himself and he cried out, "Let everyone leave my presence." Everyone leaves, and then he turns to the brothers and he makes himself known. He says, "I am Joseph." He can't keep the facade alive anymore.
That would have been such a shock to them.
One of the original big twists of literature we've just read is Joseph revealing himself to his brothers.
And I wonder if the brothers like believed him straight away.
Well, it seems like they didn't.
No, because he sort of has to say it twice.
Yeah, he literally has to repeat it multiple times before they seem to start. I think it's probably more shock than disbelief.
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, it takes them a while.
I think I would too. Like, you know, like, no, hang on. What, like, you know, like your mind would have just been racing blank, whatever. Like, is this another trick by you? Are we about to get thrown into jail, like, or killed or whatever? Like,
Did you just see it in your magic cup?
Yeah.
I like that it says, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God," giving all that credit to like his journey.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sums up the whole purpose of the Joseph story, which he'll sum up again in a few chapters' time in a very similar sounding verse, is everything God uses for good, even though you intended it for evil.
Yes. Like what we said last week, even what feels like the bad or feels like a real down and low point in life, God will still use that for good.
Yeah.
I was a little bit confused about the phrase father to Pharaoh.
Yeah, fair.
I'm not sure why, but I just didn't see it as that kind of relationship, like described like that.
Yeah. So Joseph calls himself a father to Pharaoh. Now, this could just be another way of saying chief advisor. Like that could be what he's trying to say. He's just one of the top advisors. But many scholars date Joseph to the reign of a pharaoh called Sesostris II, and then also to the reign of that pharaoh's son, Sesostris III. There's a high chance I butchered the name of that pharaoh, but many scholars think that the first pharaoh that we meet at the beginning of the Joseph story died within the first few years of the good years, the years of plenty, and then his young son takes the throne as the new pharaoh just as the famine hits. And that's just what happens when you try to align the list of pharaohs we have from Egyptian history and the biblical story, and that's where Joseph fits best. And so there's a chance that Joseph has actually helped raise this new pharaoh over the last few years in his first few years in office.
Yep.
And if that's the case, then he's had more than just a chief advisor role. Like, as the second in command of the kingdom, he's almost had a fatherly role if this is the case.
That makes sense. That's kind of cool. I like that. That sort of, I don't know, it sort of fits quite nicely if that is the case.
Yeah, which would date this interaction to around 1878 BC, if it is during the reign of Sesostris III.
And it also could just mean like fatherly as like giving that advice, like that parental advice to someone. It doesn't necessarily like, whether it was, maybe a bit more like a fatherly role as we sort of like potentially said, or it was just as advice, like because he is the chief advisor, just giving advice like a parent would give advice. Makes sense either way.
Yeah, I agree.
There was one other thing in this part that stood out to me, and it was verse 5. It says, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." And I like that little glimpse of grace that he gives. Like his personality shows there, I reckon.
Yeah, definitely. And what's good is if you continue reading from verse 5, he explains why it's a good thing he was sold into slavery. And that's because he was able to save the land of Egypt from the great famine and then also save his own family from the coming famine. And so we know way back at the beginning of the story that Abraham was promised that through his offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. And here we start to see one outworking of that.
Yes.
Now, as Christians, we believe there is a far greater outworking of that in Jesus, but we do see an outworking of this promise to Abraham here in the life of Joseph, where he saves the entire nation of Egypt from starvation, and then also all the surrounding nations that can come to Egypt for food as well.
I just think, he had every right to be so angry and really lash out on them, but the way he handled it was actually pretty decent.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
It shows he's really developed maturity. He's become an incredibly mature and wise leader and man.
Especially when we first saw him, he was a bit sort of naive,
arrogant.
Arrogant. Now,
I guess he hasn't really had a choice. He got given a lot of responsibility.
He's also been forced to grow up quite quickly.
No, I just think it's a nice reminder to I don't know, you can look past what people have done to you. Obviously, you don't forgive someone for selling you and it's pretty crap, but yeah, I think you can look past things to an extent. But
And one of the reasons Joseph gives to that is because he truly believes that God is the one in charge of everything. So Genesis walks this line that actually the rest of Christian scripture walks as well, which is saying that God is in total control, but humans are fully morally responsible for their actions. And so both are absolutely true. The brothers' original deed of selling Joseph was evil, but Joseph rests on the idea that God is in total control.
Yeah.
And then Joseph tells the brothers, bring my father here. Clearly the whole world is in famine. There's still several more years of famine to come. Come to Egypt. I will look after you all. Go get him.
And this is now the start of the journey where the family's going to be reunited. It's been such a long time that everyone's been separated and thinking that Joseph's dead and all that. And now we're sort of seeing the mending of this broken family coming back together.
But I think Joseph is a little worried about that because as he sends his brothers back to Israel to collect his father to bring back to Egypt, he tells them, don't quarrel on the way. Now, the reason I think he says that is if they're about to go to their father and say, Joseph is alive, they're going to have to explain their crime from 20 plus years ago.
Which I thought about that going, why didn't Jacob ask or just be wait, he's alive? Hang on, but you said he was dead. What happened?
In the brothers' defense, they could just claimed they found a bloody robe.
True.
They never claimed to have found the body.
True, that's true. But then also in the same breath, Jacob was probably so overwhelmed that he was alive. And also that Benjamin came back. That too.
He's about to have all of his children back.
Yeah, that Yeah, maybe the thought did occur, but like, I was like, hang on, what happened? But just overwhelming, like, I don't care anymore. Like, what matters now is that I have all my sons.
But I think the reason Joseph warns them is you can imagine the brothers on the road home quarreling about the story they're going to give Jacob and how they're going to explain why Joseph is alive when initially they thought he was dead, and who they were going to blame and accuse. Like, you can picture the fight that is right there with the potential to tear apart this family just before they're reunited.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I just don't understand why they all went back and forwards. Like, they've done so many Ks. Like, just send one person. And the fittest, strongest brother, the rest just hang out, catch up.
That's true.
That is true, but also this is a time period where a band of robbers on the road can end you. And so there's something about safety in numbers.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. And also, for Jacob to really believe them as well, they needed all the brothers to come back. Well, bar Joseph safely.
I'm surprised he didn't keep Benjamin with him.
Well, they wouldn't have believed him.
Yeah.
I think even if they tried to explain, I think Jacob would have been like in such a state,
distraught.
Yeah, like even them trying to like calm him down, I don't who knows whether like how Jacob would have reacted, but I think you would have needed everyone there just to convince Jacob at that point.
Mine says Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. What does that mean? Why is it talking about his own hand?
So this is simply a promise that Jacob is going to die in peace, surrounded by his family. So Jacob was afraid that he was going to die and most of his sons were dead before him, and that he was going to die in an awful, sorrowful way. And this is God promising that you will die amongst your family in a loving environment. Because, I mean, Jacob's, 130 at this point? And so Jacob's probably thinking about what will be the manner of my death, and God promises it will be a peaceful one.
Yeah, and it's probably thinking about where he's going to die as well, especially because he knows about his family's tomb, and sort of like the final resting point is probably very important to him as well, because at that age he's moving away from his land. Like, we're going into this unknown land, going into this foreign country here with the Egyptian people. So lots of thoughts, racing at that age about like what's gonna happen to me. And getting that sort of reassurance would be quite nice.
And then I'm not going to lie, I skipped over this next bit because it looks a lot like a mini genealogy to me. And I'm not really into that.
I know how much you hate genealogies, so every time one's coming up, I like mentally prepare myself to have this conversation with you. But when I read through this, I didn't read it as a genealogy, which could just be my bad. But I just read it as a list of the people going to Egypt with Jacob.
Like, I see more than 5 names in a chapter, and I'm like, it's a genealogy.
Like, you are right. It is, in a very strict definition, the genealogy of Jacob and his sons and their kids. It just didn't click with me that this is what it was, because I was like, oh, look, it's a list of everyone traveling with Jacob. Excellent.
This is a big family that's moving. This
70.
Yeah, this is a lot that's like moving across into Egypt. Like, you just think about like the brothers are the only people to get you mentioned. So you just like, oh, so the brothers go and they pick up their dad and then they go back. It's like 70 people. It's a large tribe.
Yeah, literally. This is the tribe of Israel.
And that would have been so nice for Joseph to see coming towards him. Like, that many people, I reckon.
Yeah. And a lot to catch up on too. I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's at this part of the story that we get it. Like, I was thinking about it before, going like, why do we get this list now? But now that we've sort of talked about the tribe of Israel needs to be in Egypt, I get now why this list is here, because we need to know who's going to Egypt and who's going to be ending up in Egypt.
Yeah.
Otherwise, having the Israelite people in the story of Moses getting like taken out of Egypt at the end of the Moses story. We don't want the tribe split. Otherwise, that story doesn't work, if that makes sense. It's like not, like releasing Egypt out of slavery. Well, it's not releasing half of Egypt out of slavery, if that makes sense. And like it's important that we know that everyone sort of moved with them, not just a couple of people.
Yeah. What's interesting here when I first read it through is that Benjamin has 10 sons. Did that stand out to anyone else? This is like, in my mind, in the story of Joseph, Benjamin's like a 12-year-old being carted back and forth, and he has 10 sons.
Yeah, no, I never thought that too.
A little kid.
Yeah.
I actually did the maths, and Benjamin at this point is probably 30 years old.
No, I don't like that.
Just putting it out there.
I don't like that the brothers are now all...
I mean, you could not like it, but it's the truth.
No, I know.
It was really wholesome before, like protecting his little brother.
Like, he still is the little brother, but I just imagine... No, because I imagine, like, maybe the other brothers, like the eldest, were like in their sort of like mid to early 20s, and like Benjamin was sort of like still in the teenage years. Oh.
No, Benjamin
I pictured like 12, maybe 12, which didn't really add up because it said 20 years earlier. But
Yeah,
like,
I know.
whatever.
Wow.
Look, I understand because I was the same. Whenever I read this story, I pictured like a very young Benjamin as this thing to be protected, and that's why Jacob wouldn't let him go. But he's a man of 30 with apparently 10 kids.
Well.
But also, when you look at Numbers 26 and 1 Chronicles 7, it shows that some of these 10 sons listed here are probably actually grandsons.
Oh.
And so there's been some very fast turnaround going on.
Turnaround.
Well, if Benjamin is a grandfather at 30.
Yes.
What?
That makes it even faster.
It does. Wow. Okay. Well, that's burst that bubble.
That is what this show is here for, to burst some bubbles.
That's true. That's very true. That Sunday school image of young brothers just gone.
And that's why you're on this show, Josh, as
I
the
know,
PK,
right?
So we could burst the PK bubbles.
We can burst the PK bubbles. That's very funny.
We then see Judah going ahead of the family. And what I think we see is, again, Judah is taking a leadership role. Like, as I said before, after Joseph, Judah is sort of the next main character in this section.
Hmm.
And so as his role as leader, he directs the way for the family to arrive in Egypt.
It would have been such a sight to see Joseph sort of arrive before them, because it says that he travels in a chariot.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, like this family sort of moving with all their, like, I'm assuming like their livestock, their family, sort of everything with them. And then this noble man, because the status of Joseph is second to the Pharaoh, like, comes along and sort of like, not flaunting his power, but there's this sort of noticeable difference, I think. And I don't think it's necessarily sort of saying that like Joseph is one up, even though that's sort of like confirmed in like the dream that Joseph has, is that everyone will bow, including Jacob, to Joseph. But I think it's just like sort of showing that like Joseph is quite well off here, and is through his journey has either acquired like sort of wealth, but shown that his journey has been different to everyone else's.
But also a chariot would just be his normal mode of transportation now, as the second highest in Egypt. If you suddenly came by a supercar, Josh, would you rock up to the family reunion by walking? No, you just take your normal means of transportation.
No, I would 100%. Oh yeah, no, this would have been normal for Joseph.
When I read this bit, in my head, I was like, why didn't he just take his chariot and he go to his dad, who's probably old? Like, why did he make the whole family come? Like, why didn't he go? I know he was like ruling people and like had responsibility.
Well, I think that is one of the answers, is that he has a lot of responsibility in the land of Egypt. But I think the other answer is he knows that there's at least 5 more years of famine to come. So he knows that the only way his family, including his father, can survive for the next period of time is to leave the famine-ravaged Canaan and come to where there is grain. And so, yeah, I guess maybe he could have gone to Canaan to collect his father, but ultimately the only way his family was going to survive was to come to Egypt.
Yeah.
And so at this point in the story, the family is united.
We have a beautiful reunion of Joseph and Jacob weeping as they embrace.
Yeah. And Jacob now says to Joseph, now I am ready to die, since I've seen your face again and you are still alive. Like, now Jacob is content with everything. And it's, as you said, it's such a sort of beautiful moment that this family has been reunited and they're just having this moment together.
I want to take a pause there, and I think I've realized something that I was getting really confused on. Mine says Israel said to Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacob consistently has been referred to as Israel.
Yes.
In mine. And I think that's why I was getting confused. I thought Israel was another character.
No, so Jacob is referred to as both Jacob and Israel.
Yeah, and then I thought, is that Israel the place? Like, is it representing the whole place? Like, that makes a lot of sense. So mine says Israel said to Joseph, now let me die.
Yeah, it's weird because when Jacob wrestled with God in a previous episode, we saw that God changes his name to Israel. And then the two names are used interchangeably throughout the rest of Genesis. So it's not like Abraham when the moment his name was changed from Abram to Abraham, it's always Abraham from then on. It just jumps back and forth with almost no apparent reason.
No, it's sort of annoying that it keeps doing that.
It's really confusing from a newbie point of view.
Oh, yeah.
Why are they asking the question, what is your occupation?
You've got to remember that right now, Egypt is the middle of famine. And 66 new people, or 67 including Jacob, have just rocked up to Egypt looking to live there. And so I think at least part of it is like, we're in the middle of some rough times. Who are you? What are you doing here? Which is why Joseph coaches them and says, tell the Pharaoh that you've brought along all your own flocks and herds and everything you own. In other words, he's saying, tell Pharaoh that you don't need anything except some land to live on. You have everything you need. And so Joseph is like preempting the question of like, are you just here to take advantage of us? But Pharaoh actually shows tremendous generosity of offering them a lovely piece of land and then all the provisions they could need. And so Joseph, in a sense, underestimates Pharaoh at this point. But of course, Joseph is the right-hand man that has got Egypt through this famine, or will get Egypt through this famine. And so potentially Pharaoh is prepared to do anything for the man that has helped preserve his kingdom.
Definitely. His chief advisor, as we said, potential father figure. I wouldn't want to, that person that you hold in such regard, I wouldn't want to do their family dirty.
Another reason Pharaoh may be asking is, as it says here in the text, all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians.
Oh, you must tell him we, your servants, have raised livestock all our lives, as our ancestors have always done. When you tell him this, he will let you live here in the region of Goshen, for the Egyptians despise shepherds.
Why do they despise them?
This probably just reflects like a common distrust of nomadic people by people like the Egyptians who always lived in cities, lived in very structured communities. And so I suspect it's less about the actual act of raising sheep and more about the type of people they were based on their lifestyle.
They could have had a different word for those that raised livestock. And so shepherd could have been that loaded word that only really specifically meant nomadic people that had sheep or livestock of some description.
Well, I mean, that's the only way nomadic people can survive, right? Is by hunting or by having large herds that they move with. Because urban dwellers will set up fields. Like they'll be farmers. You can't be a farmer and a nomad.
No.
And so Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen, which later will bear the name the district of Ramesses, which may ring some bells, those who have studied Egypt before.
Yeah, the name sounds familiar.
It's one of the most famous pharaohs
of
all time. And then Pharaoh also puts all of his own livestock in the hands of Joseph's family and says, well, if you're so good at this thing, look after mine as well. And so again, we see Pharaoh's generosity shining through.
And then Joseph brings and presents Jacob to the Pharaoh. And this was sort of like a big honorable moment to present one's father to the ruler of the land. Sort of, this is the person that is the head of my household and I'm going to present him to you. And you want this interaction to go well.
Definitely.
And, I think in these times, this is how wars sort of start if it doesn't go well.
I don't think the 70 people that Jacob has is going to be a match for Egypt.
No, I don't think so either.
But also potentially to your point, this is why Jacob rocks up and blesses Pharaoh twice. So at the beginning of the interaction, he blesses Pharaoh, and at the end of the interaction, he blesses Pharaoh. And again, we see that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Like this is more of that original promise to Abraham coming through his family line.
And it's funny how Pharaoh just asks, how old are you? My brain that's like looks at him going, my gosh, how old are you, man?
Well, I think we're mildly meant to get the impression that Jacob is this I don't want to use the word pathetic, but really old looking person. Like he's potentially hobbled in on his staff. Yeah. Because his staff is mentioned a few times in these chapters about how he's clearly using that to lean on. And so Pharaoh asks him, how old are you? And he responds with, not as old as my father or grandfather lived for. My years have been short. They've been 130, which to us is like, whoa.
Yeah, short.
That's so long. But compared to how long his father and grandfather lived, that is a surprisingly short lifespan, which again, I think Morgan asked many episodes ago about the lifespans in Genesis. And by the end of Genesis, the lifespans are to a range that we would find very normal because they've slowly decreased.
And as we see, the tribe of Israel is residing in Egypt. They get given the land and they set up shop there. So as we're getting into the second half of 47, we're seeing the famine continue on. At this point in the story, we've sort of only had the interactions between Joseph, Pharaoh, Joseph's family, and we haven't really sort of seen this famine that was predicted. Yep. And we're still going to get another 5 years of this famine.
Yep. And in that time, every person who lived in Egypt gives all of their money to Joseph in exchange for the grain that he controls. Then they give him all of their livestock and then all of their land. And then Joseph gives them seeds and says, from now on, you'll give 1/5 of all your crops to the Pharaoh forevermore, like as an ongoing, always thing.
Do we know if that rings true in history?
So one Egyptologist says that there is ample evidence that Pharaoh considered himself the owner of all Egyptian property whatsoever. And so this is the Bible's way of explaining why in every dynasty of Egypt from this point onwards, it was always considered that all of the land was Pharaoh's, effectively on loan to people, but owned by the Pharaoh. And it's almost like this is the explanation of why Egypt ended up that way. As for the ongoing of giving 1/5 of your crops always to the Pharaoh, I'm not sure about. I didn't look into that specifically in preparation for this episode.
And it must have been a real harsh famine for the extent of this happening. They've just given everything over just so that they can survive.
And I think some modern readers read this and was like, wow, look how Joseph exploits the people here. But if you look at their response, they are overjoyed. They say, you have saved our lives. I think the situation was so dire, as you've just said. And Joseph's plan has saved all of Egypt.
Yeah, because I don't necessarily think this is exploitation. And I think that's because I think, we come from maybe the perspective of we're for Joseph here and we've seen his deeds before and they haven't necessarily been exploitive. So Joseph's doing just the right thing and providing for all the people in a sort of maybe very fair and just way.
And then we see the contrast, which is while all the people of Egypt are selling everything they have just to eat, the family of Jacob, the Israelites, flourished. They acquired property, they were fruitful, they increased greatly in number.
What if there was a certain someone that's maybe looking after them?
Give me a hint. What might his name be?
Well, Joseph, but I think I think Yahweh through Joseph.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what we're meant to see, is that God blesses his people and protects them, even in this new land.
Still, that blessing is, holding true of he will bless his people, protect his people.
And then we hit verse 28, and suddenly 17 years pass.
So they should be at this point out of the famine.
Well and truly out of the famine. I think we're now just into business as usual. Life is okay. Clearly, the famine is over because we've jumped 17 years within a verse.
And they're still, and the tribe of Israel is still in Egypt. At this point, they could have left.
Yeah.
Well, the famine's over. We're doing really well. Let's go back because we don't have to stay here.
But we see the same concept of put your hand under my thigh again.
We do. Josh, did you have something extra to add about this topic since last time we discussed it?
I do. One of our listeners actually sent us their thoughts on it, which I do encourage everyone to send in because we'd love to know what you think about these passages. Now, one of our listeners says that upon listening to that last bit,
as in the time that Abraham got his servant to place his hand under his thigh.
Yes.
So many episodes ago.
That whoever's written it has probably made this section very PG, and that it probably was actually touching their reproduction organ. That through history, there's multiple circumstances where this oath has been done by holding one's testicles, and the word testicles that's where we get testify. Its root word comes from testicles.
Well, there you go. I'll never be able to say the word testify again.
No, so it's a bit like, oh, okay. But
Testify is my favorite worship song.
Not anymore.
And so the authors, the author of Genesis has probably just made it a little bit nice for us to read, and that potentially, we can't say this for necessarily certain, but potentially it was more than just under the thigh.
Which we said last time was an oath saying that if I don't fulfill this promise, may my offspring avenge me.
Now, nevertheless, this doesn't change the meaning whatsoever. It's just maybe giving us a bit more insight into it. And thank you for sending that in. And we'd love to hear more, bits and pieces that either we missed or just interesting things that have come up. So continue to send in your questions and comments like that. So that's just a little bit of interesting, more information on top.
But we should probably talk about what is being promised here.
Yes.
Which is that Israel, or Jacob, depending on what we call him, calls Joseph in and says, I know I'm at the end of my life. I'm almost dead. I want you to promise that you will bury me in the family tomb back in the land of Canaan.
At this point, Jacob is probably too old to travel back to the land of Canaan. And he knows this, but he wants his body to go back, his body to be buried back into the land that God had promised his people, the land of Canaan. And this promise is leading up to what sort of God is saying to Jacob back in when Jacob gave the tribute, the blessing, and then what we think is the blessing of thanksgiving back in the land of Bathsheba, where in chapter 46, verse 4, I will go with you down to Egypt and I will bring you back again. So not alive, but the body being brought back and sort of God being there with him the entire time.
Yes. Because every time Jacob leaves the land of Israel, he has a vision of God promising that God will remain with him wherever he goes, which is just a really nice element of Jacob's life.
Yeah, and even in death, God will be there with him. Oh, I'm hoping that, Jacob's going to be with God at that point, but yes, always with him.
It's also important to point out that Jacob hasn't yet died, because next episode we'll read all of his final words, because he has a lot to say before he dies, before he passes away.
This 147-year-old man still has things to say.
Yes.
Yet another cliffhanger.
Yes, correct. Does anyone have a footnote at the end of verse 31?
Yes.
Then read it for us.
No, I'm just
okay.
Finding it.
Sorry.
Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed.
Yeah, Greek version reads, and Israel bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. Compare it to Hebrew 11:21.
Wait, what? What does your verse 31 say then? Because what your footnote says is what my normal verse says.
So not in the footnote.
Verse 31
Verse
for you
31 says, swear that you will do it, Jacob insisted. So Joseph gave his oath, and Jacob bowed humbly at the head of his bed.
That's so interesting, because mine is the exact opposite of yours, Josh. What yours says in the main bit, mine puts in a footnote, and then yours is the opposite of, yeah, okay.
Mine's in the main bit too, not the footnote.
So I'm using NIV, and it ends with Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. But then the footnote reads, or it could be translated, Israel bowed down at the head of his bed. Yeah. And the reason I wanted to bring our attention to this is because Joseph had a dream where every member of his family bowed before him. And until this point in the story, we haven't yet seen his father bow before him. And so while this is only a potential translation, there's the chance that this is the final fulfillment of Joseph's dream way, way, way back.
And it's interesting that it's only after the swearing the oath that Jacob bows down.
Yeah.
Like it's nowhere before. It's not like bowing down when they first meet. It's only after sort of going through this journey and 17 years after the arrival in Egypt that then the bowing has that, this mark of respect to Joseph happens.
In gratitude and in thanks. Maybe also because of just how frail he is now. But as that final complete full circle completion of Joseph's dream.
After finishing up tonight's episode, my takeaway probably is like what I said before about, I don't know, I just got a reminder that when people do bad things to you, don't necessarily have to act back in anger, to have that little bit of grace. I don't know, it's just a bit of a reminder I sat on tonight.
Yeah, because I was actually going to say that exact same thing, Morgan, is of everything we've read tonight, the thing that stuck out to me the most is when you reflected on the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. And obviously that was the entire first half of what we talked about, is Joseph using this weird and wacky plan to see if his brothers have changed and whether he even wants to reconcile with them. But just that it is totally possible they do reconcile. The family's back together again. And if it's possible for Joseph, who was literally sold into slavery by his brothers, then it's definitely possible for us today in the 21st century to reconcile with people.
And I think on the back of that is just seeing that the change in Judah. I think that's as well as Joseph's reconcile, but also the change in character that we see in Judah, and actually sort of not being selfish and just thinking about himself or anyone else, but like wanting to give up his own self to save his other brothers, and taking the charge and being that leader. Like even if like we mess up or other people's mess up, there's the room for us to change and for God to change us into the people that he wants us to be. Now, we shared a comment that one of our listeners sent to us, and we'd love you to send more of those comments, more of those little bits and pieces that you've found, or just questions that have come up. We'd just love you to send them in to us and send them through our social medias, or if you're on Patreon, you can send them there. We'll see your comments there. And if you want to support us financially, head over to Patreon, where you get extra content, you get early content and extra long content there. And it's just a way to financially support us there. Now, our Q&A episode is coming up, so send in your questions. That episode is dedicated to just looking at the questions that you've sent in and us going through it and trying to answer them to the best of our ability. Now, don't forget to share this podcast around. We want not only this podcast to be shared with everyone, but we want the word of God to be shared. Lockie, can I get you to end us in prayer?
Absolutely. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your word. Thank you for your servant Joseph and what he went through and the way he was able to reconcile with his brothers and set that good example for us. I pray for all of us that we may be able to take something really practical away from this passage, whether it be reconciliation with someone or something else that you are convicting us of. Allow us to actually act on your word as we read it. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Well, Lockie and Morgan, thank you. Thank you to everyone watching and listening, and we'll see everyone next week. Bye.
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 A Mustard Seed Creative Production.